Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Her Life, the Gothic, and the Inspirations. A brief summarization of Rebecca Baumann's Frankenstein 200, The Birth, the Life, and Resurrection of Mary Shelley's Monster. Mary Shelley and the Birth of Frankenstein, The Gothic, The Monsters Books, and Mad Science. To understand a work, sometimes it's beneficial to understand the author and their positionalities. Thus, to deconstruct and then reconstruct Frankenstein for edification, we must first engage in a similar approach of Mary Shelley, the true mother of monsters. Shelley's life was a case of constant loss, passion, and intrigue. She learned early on the cost of creation. Concerning passion, we have Percy Shelley, her lover and then husband, who was a privileged golden child of a member of Parliament. With his unconventional attitudes and publishings, even in his youth, he was making a name for himself, to Strozzi, to the necessity of atheism. He met Mary soon after, much bumbling around, and after his marriage to Harriet Westbrook, where they consummated their passion in spite of his marital status. Later, they had a daughter who died in less than 2 weeks, much to their despair. Then there was a son who would die before the publication of Frankenstein. Both incidences were budding inspiration for her novel, but the mindset of creation exchanges, for example, the loss of her son for Frankenstein's publication, the loss of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, for her life, those would never leave her. With all these costs of creation, Shelley encompassed her work Frankenstein in the foreboding sense of loss and a cost of creation. Every character and every aspect was heavily influenced by her real-life encounters and real-life friends and family. They were the rock stars of their day. Byron was scandal in both literary and literal sense, Percy the lover and intellectual, Polydon the aspiring writer, Claire the somewhat petulant yet intelligent stepsister, and then Mary Shelley herself, a heady mix of intellectualism and sexual lifestyle intrigue. Needless to say, the novel is an enduring work of genius, authored primarily by a 19-year-old woman who was influenced by a heady soup of sexual energy, demonic and delightful personalities, intellectual rigor, and rebellious philosophy. Even though each of the four had a hand in the conception of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley alone is the mother of monsters. Alas, if only monsters were purely fictional, but Shelley found her own monsters in the form of critics and obstacles toward publication. Her books strayed from traditional Gothic, which is already controversial in of itself, making the goal of the novel a material experiment gone awry, rather than a spectral ghost. It was blasphemous, for it portrayed creation without God, and espoused the political radicalism of William Godwin. The book was eventually published, but without Shelley's name, leaving the readership to assume Percy the author. Eventually, she was given credit, but with all the scandal tied to her name, who she lived with, her ideals, perhaps her book would have never been published if she had not done what many female writers had done in the past: publish anonymously. Despite its later success and importance, Shelley was not immune to the unimaginable tragedies that appeared shortly after Frankenstein. Multiple family and friend suicides, which followed with Byron and Percy's deaths. All of her children died before the age of 3, excluding Percy Florence. As she aged and withered, her writing followed suit with controversy and political radicalism, taking a backseat in place of more subtle tones or entirely changed material to fit a more conservative approach, one less the product of a rebellious teenage mind soaking in sensationalism, and more in line with the social norms of the day. What does that reveal about society? About people's experiences, if any? Perhaps it was being alone that rendered these changes. Regardless of changes around her, Shelley's allure for the Gothic remained relatively unchanged. When it comes to Gothic writing, no novel is as well known and emotionally Gothic as Frankenstein. Despite at the time of its publication, the Gothic genre was well established, Frankenstein continued to push the envelope, and in usual Shelley fashion, it went even further, as to be expected within the Gothic, replacing ghosts with a monster and a supernatural agency with science. Yet, for all its Gothic elements, Shelley was never one to be limited, and thus openly straying from traditional Gothic features, such as the 2 villain heroes in place of one, a laboratory instead of his castle, and science instead of the supernatural. Furthermore, there is obvious humanity within the monster. He is a literate being fully able to express his anguish. This element of the monster's literacy requires suspension of disbelief, for you must believe he can't learn by simply observing from a distance. Through his observations and readings of the Sorrows of Young Weather, Paradise Lost, and Plutarch's Lives, the monster's influence in how he thinks, speaks, treats others, and treats himself. With knowledge comes responsibility, and in this case for the monster, perhaps ignorance could have been bliss. Regardless of one's feelings for the monster, we cannot escape the most well-known perspective of Frankenstein, a dire warning amidst the dangers of science. Just because we can, should we? The issue with these readings not only tend to ignore the emotional core of the novel, but also grossly oversimplify the role of science in the story. The novel itself surprisingly has little science in it. Despite mentions of Victor's studies, the monster's creation is pretty vague. All the fancy gear, mad scientists, levers, the electrodes, harnessing the lightning, those are all inventions of Hollywood for the stage. Comparatively, Shelley's novel seems pretty lacking. The novel referenced many think pieces on genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. However, many have taken to reading the novel as anti-science, which could not be further from Shelley's intentions. Her response to science was always curiosity, not fear. Shelley drew from a lot of research, both primary and secondary, and scientific works when orchestrating Frankenstein. She used stories about people like resurrection men William Burke and William Hare of Edinburgh, who were grave robbers that worked to provide bodies for dissection theaters. Body snatching was common, and the study of anatomy in Europe was at an all-time high. Thus, cadavers were in high demand. As a result, inspiration must have struck, for Shelley's monsters composed of dead animals and humans. Also, physician and philosopher Luigi Galvani and his nephew Giovanni Aldini's work, where electric tissue contraction on dead frogs, must have made Shelley's mind run wild. Frankenstein's Victor experiments reflect Aldini's experiment on dead convicted murderer George Forrester, where he was able to shock his arm into waving hello as his eyes popped open. As horrific and terrifying as these galvanist experiments were, their goal was to bring victims of drowning, suffocation, and hanging back to life. Playing creator, sound familiar? All in all, Shelley's work was more than science. It was curiosity, pain, yearning, fear, but also anger. It speaks to treatment to outcasts, the innate urge to not be alone, and the burden of creation. So, what is Frankenstein to you?